Hello, and welcome to Clearer Thinking with Spencer Greenberg, the podcast about ideas that matter. I'm Josh Castle, the producer of the podcast, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. In this episode, Spencer speaks with Raffi Grinberg about skill acquisition, relationship development, perspectives on investment, and finding jobs effectively.
Raffi, welcome.
Thank you.
Do you think that most people don't learn the skills they need as an adult, or at least don't learn them early enough?
Yes. I think that there are many adult skills that people learn through trial and error or life experience, and even some that must be learned that way. But there are many others that I don't think have to be learned that way. And as an example, I'll say someone could be in a relationship and the relationship doesn't work out because the two people are incompatible, and that makes sense. But there could be another relationship that doesn't work out because the two people are actually very compatible, but one of them hasn't learned some very basic relationship skills that I think could be taught in the way that we teach things like math. And that's really a shame, because if they had learned those skills, that relationship could have worked out. I think there are many examples like that, which is why I'm a fan of this idea of teaching adulting skills preventatively.
So it sounds like you think there are both adulting skills that people will eventually learn through trial and error, but maybe things could be more efficient or their life could be made better if they learned them earlier. And then there's this other set of adulting skills maybe many people never learn.
Yes, and I think it's a big hodgepodge and spectrum for many different people. So maybe there's some things everyone learns eventually, like everyone will learn how to do their own laundry, even if your parents never force you to. And in fact, it's not that hard to figure out. And so even if someone is never taught in school, the pain of figuring out is not so great that it's worth teaching something so basic in school. But there are other things where the pain of having to figure it out for yourself or of never figuring it out is so great that it's worth teaching.
Now, we're going to get into a bunch of these specific skills, and hopefully you can teach our listeners some of them, at least to give them a taste. Before we do that, what are some of the categories?
I grouped the curriculum in the course that I taught called Adulting 101 into 4 categories. So I had financial skills, that's like how to invest your money, get insurance, and so forth. There's career skills, like how to succeed in your first job and how to build a career long term. There's relationship skills, in which I include how to be a better communicator, how to go about even dating and deciding if and when you want to get married. And then the last category, which is actually usually the first one I teach, but it's the hardest to explain, which I call mental skills. Some combination of like mental health and resilience, but just basic ways that you can think better that lead, I think, to better mental health.
Let's start with relationship skills, because I think it applies to everyone, and we've already mentioned it. So what do you think a key relationship skill is that many people don't learn or learn much later than they should?
A big one is how to disagree constructively. I think when I even use the term disagreement, it has negative connotations for a lot of people. Like a disagreement must mean an argument or that there's sort of some unpleasantness involved. But I actually think a disagreement is like the best type of conversation, because it means that two people have different viewpoints. And so there's more to be learned from either side. And so I actually spent a good portion of my career teaching what I call the art of constructive disagreement.
And what does that mean, constructive disagreement, rather than, let's say, destructive or whatever a normal disagreement would be?
Yeah, constructive meaning that both people can gain something. So there might be an argument that's fruitless, and that would not be a constructive disagreement. But constructive means that both people, I think it requires that both people have the attitude of wanting to learn. That's like the number one quote unquote technique or tip that I try to teach is if you approach a disagreement with an agenda, and that agenda could be I'm trying to win the argument, or I'm trying to look smart in front of my peers, or I'm trying to convince the other person that they're wrong and I'm right, that is more likely to lead it to not be constructive. But if you approach with an attitude of curiosity, like I want to learn as much as possible about the other person's perspective, it will be constructive.
Now, of course, you can, to some extent, control your own attitude, but you can't control the other person's attitude. If the other person is not coming in with the point of view of learning, but you do, does it still help, or does it have to be done by both parties?
I love this question. Yes, I think this is the key question. And I would break it down into 2 sub-questions. The first one is, are all of these disagreements worth your time? And the answer is obviously no. There might be some people with whom you realize quickly that you're wasting your time, or even you can know beforehand it's a waste of time to talk to them. But what I would caution people against is making that determination just by yourself and too quickly. I think we all have in our heads this version of the Overton window. That term is used to describe kind of what's acceptable in public discourse, but we all have our own version of it in our heads. And so we think that someone with an opposing viewpoint, let's say on politics, right? Like, let's say I'm a Democrat and there's a Republican who wants lower taxes. And I think lower taxes, that's just totally outside my Overton window. That's too crazy. I'm not even going to engage with that person because they don't know their basic facts. I think most people would look at that scenario and say, no, that person should not be outside your Overton window. The question of what is the right tax rate is still a very open debate in the world, and like it's worth engaging with people. So I think most people would say, like, yes, that's obvious. Expand your Overton window. Be willing to at least engage with someone who disagrees with you on that. But I think the problem is that most people don't have a self-awareness of how narrow their Overton window is. And so if you give yourself the excuse of being able to say, it's not worth talking to this person because it's not worth my time, your Overton window might stay narrow forever. And so I try to encourage people to approach conversations, even ones that you think might be outside of your window, with this attitude of like adventure and exploration. You're like, this person believes that the earth is flat. Like, that is just downright crazy. They don't know basic science. But my attitude would be, if there's someone who like seems like a decent, reasonably intelligent person who believes the earth is flat, like, why do they think that? That's fascinating. Like, I'm really curious how they came to that conclusion. And maybe at the end of the conversation, I'll come away and think like, yeah, they just don't understand some basic things, or they're downright stupid. That's possible. But I think more likely I learn something about them and therefore something about human nature.
I think sometimes ideas seem outlandish to us, and so we may not want to engage. But sometimes ideas are just offensive to us. And I think that often turns people off from having an engagement.
What do you mean offensive? I struggle with this word because I think it's semantically overloaded, right? It can mean different things to different people.
Well, I'm someone who's incredibly low and feeling offended. So,
me too.
but I'm trying to get in the mind. A lot of people feel offended, right? They read Twitter, they feel offended. I think what a lot of people are pointing at there is that they have a negative emotional reaction to what they're reading. Like, they feel angry at the person who wrote it, or they feel angry at the person the post is about, let's say, or maybe they feel scared.
I would love to address this. I think it relates to the topics that I tend to teach about related to mental skills, right? Of how to approach situations where you think that certain emotions are going to be triggered, even if you know the situation could be good for you. Like, reading an opposing viewpoint, probably good for you, but if it makes you angry in the short term, it's not good for you. So how do you get over that? I also wanted to make sure first, though, that I address kind of the second part of your first question, or at least something that I think was implicit in it, of like, a lot of people go into these disagreements and they say, well, I do want the other person to have that same curiosity towards me that I'm showing towards them. I do want them, in an ideal world, to be persuaded by what I'm saying. And I think persuasion is possible. It just rarely takes place during the course of one conversation. I sometimes ask people, like, think about a time that you changed your mind on a deeply held belief during the span of like one conversation. And it's very rare. I think what's more common when people change their minds is that a conversation can plant a seed. It's the seed of a new idea or a new perspective. And now that that seed is in the metaphorical garden of your mind, it can be watered over time. So if you give me some argument that I'd never heard of before of like why taxes should be lower, the next time I see something, a piece of evidence or another argument that reinforces what you said, that seed will grow into a small plant and so forth. And eventually that plant may be so big that I have a new belief in my garden. And so I think that if your approach during conversation is the good one of coming with curiosity and you're assuming the same good intention of the other person, you might end up planting a seed in their garden of their mind that will be watered over time. You just have to be equally open to having the seed planted in your own as well.
I think that's a nice way to put it. I like that. Can you give us an example of how a conversation might typically go that's not so good, and then what would be a better way of the conversation going?
I think when a disagreement goes poorly, it's because something you mentioned, right? People's emotions flare up. And the psychologist Jonathan Haidt has a great metaphor for this. He says our minds are like a rider sitting on top of an elephant. And the elephant is our system one thinking, our intuitive, fast, sometimes emotional responsiveness. And our rider is the system two, the more rational reason, take a step back and reflect thinking. And so we often tend to think it's the rider who's in control, but in reality, according to many studies, it seems like it's the elephant that's in control. What does that mean? It means when someone says to me, let's say I'm a part of some group. Again, using my example, but flipping it this time, I'm a Republican, and someone comes to me and says, all Republicans are stupid. What's actually more likely to happen is my elephant is going to react. I'm going to have this immediate intuitive reaction of like, that is hurtful, that's offensive, it's going to make me angry, it's going to make me see the other person as an enemy and not a friend. And all these things are going to happen before my system two thinking, my rider can kick in. And what's going to happen when my rider kicks in is actually just justify the conclusion I've already reached. So we all like to think that our rider is going to be more reasoned, but really what happens more often is our rider is going to think, yes, that person is denigrating you, he's bad too, you should treat him like the enemy. And so this whole framework around the rider and the elephant, I think, is helpful to keep in mind because it teaches you that when one of these flare-ups can happen in a conversation, You can recognize the other person is struggling with that same inner turmoil and do what we call appeasing the elephant, right? Trying to realign or reset expectations around the conversation to lower the temperature, lower the flaring up of our elephants. And there's some basic ways of doing that, like trying to show that you're on the same side. Like, oh, it sounds like what I said just offended you. I apologize for that. Of course, you can always apologize, things like that. And more importantly, you can say, I want to learn what your perspective is. My goal here is not to offend you. My goal is not even to convince you that you're wrong. My goal is to understand where you're coming from. And that requires some effort on both of our parts, but I'm going to do my best to try to listen and understand. So that's one thing you could say, but I think what it's trying to do is establish this shared intent. Like the conversation is not a zero-sum game. It's actually a positive-sum game where if we both learn, then we've both benefited.
Okay, so it seems like there's at least two pragmatic tips there. One is coming into that conversation really trying to learn from the other person, and the other is sort of tracking the elephant, like what are the emotions going on here, and making sure to deal with that by, let's say, making the person feel comfortable, or if they're getting upset, addressing that before you proceed. Any other specific tips for having constructive disagreements?
Yeah, I can try to clarify that with a framework. So the framework is how to engage in empathetic listening. And so it's especially useful when you disagree with someone or when someone says something and your initial reaction is to feel hurt by it. The first step is just to acknowledge what they said. Be like, you said this, that sounds like that was hurtful to you or offensive to you. I'm sorry for that. Kind of acknowledging their emotional state. The second step is to ask questions and try to understand better what their viewpoint is so that you can do the third step, which is repeat it back to them. So I want to get to the point that I've understood your perspective so well that I can repeat it back to you. And you would say something like, yes, that's exactly what I mean. You said it even better than I could say it. And only after that third step would I suggest going to the fourth step, which is sharing your own perspective and then finally trying to problem solve together.
It reminds me of Rappaport's rules, if you're familiar with that. It's this idea that I guess to do a really good job of debate, you should be able to explain your opponent's point of view as well as they can, or even better, so that they're like, thank you, you explained it so clearly. And if you haven't achieved that bar, then you may not be ready to really have a debate with someone.
Yeah, exactly. And if I'm reading into your example correctly, it's in the context of debate where your goal might be to try to outwit the opponent or prove them wrong or something like that. And of course, that's a super useful tool because if you can articulate their argument better than they can, you can then use it to your own sort of rhetorical or logical tactics and to your own advantage. But I'd say even the conversation that's not adversarial, that's intended to be constructive, it's so helpful because then it really proves what I was saying earlier of showing that you're on the same side as the other person. If I'm able to articulate what you're saying better than you can articulate yourself, you're like, yes, you're on the same page as me, you understand me, you're actually trying to make an effort here.
Yeah, and I think those rules were also designed to try to create better, more constructive conversations as well. So that could be interesting for people to read about. Okay, so we've talked about disagreeing constructively. I totally agree with you. It's an incredibly important life skill. And we all kind of face this when we talk to family members or friends or on the internet. What's another relationship skill that you think is really essential? A lot of people don't learn early enough or don't learn at all.
I think a lot of people don't learn about dating. There's a few sort of things here. One of them is a lot of people grow up with these myths around romantic love that get perpetuated by like pop music and Disney movies and things like that. And as we alluded to earlier, some people naturally grow out of these and realize that they're myths, but some people, the myths kind of stay with them for their whole life and poison all of their relationships. Another thing is how people approach dating. There are, I'd say, a great many people who have the long-term goal of wanting to end up with a single partner for life, but the way that they actually go about dating is sort of counter to that goal.
So what are some of these myths people encounter?
I think one of them is that your ideal partner should fulfill all of your needs. There's kind of this idea that once you find your true love, you won't need anyone else, and they can provide for you in every way, right? Emotionally, spiritually, financially, sexually, and so forth. And so I think that if you meet a partner who can provide a lot of those things, that's fantastic. And they're probably more likely to be your quote unquote soulmate. But it's completely unrealistic to think that you will only ever need one person in your life. It's very likely you will continue to need to rely on your parents, your siblings, your children, your extended community, friends, and so forth. And so the myth can be harmful to people when they say, oh, my partner's great in these like 99 ways, but there's this 100th way that they like don't provide for me. They don't give me the same, I'm going to make this up. They don't give me the same like emotional support when I'm talking that my best friend does. Therefore, this person is not the right fit for me. And I think that could be harmful because that person may very well be the right fit for you if they're ticking 99 of the 100 boxes, and that the ideal life situation for you is you end up marrying that person, but you also keep your best friend because you do need your best friend too.
Yeah, I think that's very wise. The reality is the chance that someone fits every single need you have so perfectly is really, really low. But the chance that they are highly compatible with you is much less low. So you can kind of get a lot of gains there.
There's also, I think, a trope that it may be less in Disney movies, but more in romantic comedies, that you start feeling attracted to someone else. And because you're attracted to someone else, and I'm saying deeply attracted, right? Not just sort of like first glance, then that means that there's something wrong with your relationship. And I think a lot of the times it's not true. A lot of the times it's perfectly human and normal to become attracted to other people. But the question of how to make a relationship survive and thrive and succeed in the long term is how you overcome those kind of inclinations and stay committed to your partner and so forth. But what often happens in these romantic comedies is you have someone who's in a relationship and it's fine, and then they meet this new person. The new person's more exciting, and that's the person they end up with at the end of the movie. And sometimes those are terrible endings in terms of what they teach, especially young people, that it's like, what if you were actually the nice guy at the beginning who was with the nice girl, and there was someone else who came in and totally disrupted the relationship? Like, that might actually be the untold hero of the story. And so it's basically teaching people implicitly, like, the happy ending is the one in which you abandon your quote unquote safe or stable or normal partner and end up with a person who you're wildly attracted to. Maybe that's the right move for some people, but obviously not for everybody.
It seems to me that this is something there are individual differences in. Some people, when they're in a romantic relationship, they seem to have eyes only for that one person. Whereas other people, they seem to, even in a deeply loving and happy romantic relationship, they still will feel sexual attraction to other people. And so I think maybe that also can complicate the story because people have really different experiences with this.
Of course. And I think it's just proves the sort of overall maxim here that, like, there's no one size fits all for something that's as complicated as love or a human relationship. Everyone has their own needs and proclivities and so forth. And so I think the meta myth is that there is a one size fits all, or at least that there's a certain model that works for other people, therefore it'll work for you. I think you can always learn from other people's models, and you can take people's good examples and glean very helpful wisdom from that. But to assume that just because every Disney movie portrays love the same way, that love must feel the same to me, is probably going to set you up for disappointment.
You also mentioned that you think that dating itself can often be done in an ineffective way. What are some of the problems with the way people try to date?
I think that a lot of people, I'm going to generalize, but I think it's true on average. A lot of people know they want to end up together with one person in a long-term monogamous relationship, but they think that they have all the time in the world to get there. And especially because most of my audience is people in their 20s, right? That your 20s is a time for quote-unquote exploring and not committing. Again, I think that might be true for some people, so I'm not going to give a one-size-fits-all approach. But I think the danger of that attitude of infinite exploration is you don't realize how long it takes to build a relationship or how long it takes to find the person that you want to end up with. And so you might get quote unquote lucky, and the first person you date might end up being your long-term partner. I personally am fortunate to have had that happen to me. The first long-term relationship I was in ended up becoming my marriage, which is amazing. But not everyone gets that lucky, and oftentimes it can take a lot of trial and error to find that person. And so if you're not lucky enough for it to happen soon, it might take you all of your 20s to find that person. So let's say you're living in that world in which it's going to take 10 years to find that person, but you spend those 10 years doing something else, which is quote unquote exploring in other ways, right? Like dating people you know that you're not going to end up with, or taking, saying that I'm so busy with my job, I'm not going to date at all. And then by the time you're 30, you're not married. And, if it's going to take you 10 years, you'll only be married when you're 40. And for a lot of people, biologically, that might be too late to have children. It's that kind of attitude of like, I have all the time in the world that I think can set people up for failure.
How do you think about the fact that when people haven't dated much, it can be hard for them to evaluate if someone's a good partner or what it even means for someone to be a good partner or what it is they're really looking for? Is there some amount of exploration needed to kind of understand those important things?
Absolutely. I have two frameworks here that might help. So the first one is this idea of approaching dating as a treasure hunt. I am naturally an introvert, and I know a lot of introverts like me don't like the social situations that might lead to meeting new people, especially new potential romantic partners, right? Like going to parties, going out on activities, asking friends to set you up. These all are just either slightly uncomfortable or slightly unpleasant. And so I think this framework can be helpful for that type of person to say, your treasure, right, the love of your life is waiting for you at the end of this quest. And every single step you take on this quest is getting you closer. Even if it doesn't make you feel like it's getting closer, like you went to a party and you didn't meet anyone who you really clicked with, that's still part of the process of just having to do that in order to find the treasure. And another thing that good heroes do when they're searching for treasure is maximize their odds by trying many different tactics at the same time. So you might decide, I'm going to go into more social situations where I can meet more people. I'm also going to ask all my friends to set me up, and I'm going to be very clear about kind of what kind of person I'm looking for, and treating it like an adventure where you can kind of diversify the ways in which you're placing your bets. The second framework that I think is helpful for someone who's in a relationship and is not sure if they want to commit is this idea that you can kind of group you and your partner's compatibility or lack thereof into 3 piles. There's like the good pile. These are the ways in which we're good together. The bad pile, the ways in which we're not. And the unknown pile, right? We haven't yet encountered a scenario where we have to deal with a difficult family member. We haven't yet encountered a scenario where we're living in the same place and have to deal with cleanliness and that kind of thing. And so if the good pile is ever bigger than the bad pile plus the unknown pile, it's probably worth committing. What I mean by that is if you basically say, okay, there's still a bunch of unknowns, but even if these unknowns turn out to be all bad, the good pile is still going to be bigger than them, then it's kind of a math no-brainer, like, yes, the good pile is bigger, you should make the commitment. And so the hard part there is determining like what are the actual unknowns? There could be infinite of them, but how you narrow it down to something finite? How do you determine when one of the unknowns is quote unquote solved or not? I don't think there's any easy answers there, but I think what the framework encourages people to do is to basically think, just like the treasure hunt, we can experiment here. We can try to put ourselves in these situations. We can try to talk about things we've never talked about before and unearth all those unknowns in order to get to the answer faster.
That's interesting. So that would suggest that if you don't have many unknowns left, so the unknown pile is very small, then if you're like, the good is just slightly better than the bad, that's enough to commit. Do you think that's true?
It depends on the situation, for sure, and I would probably advise someone differently depending on the very specifics of their situation. But as a general framework, I think what it helps people do is also get faster to the part where they get to reap the benefits of commitment. I think one of the benefits of commitment is you don't have to be worrying about this at all anymore. Every unknown is no longer a question of like, this could be a reason that we're going to break up or not end up together. And rather, every unknown becomes like a fun mystery, right? Of like, I don't know this about you. Let's figure it out. And like, worst case, it's a bad thing, but we're still going to stay together. And so our question is not going to be, should we break up? Our question is going to be, how do we resolve this difference? Or how do we continue to live with each other despite having this difference?
My mom once said to me something that I thought was very wise, which was, when looking for a partner, look for someone whose flaws are flaws that you don't mind so much. And I found that really helpful because it orients you towards thinking, you're not looking for a perfect person. You're looking for a person, every person's flawed, right? No matter who they are. So you want someone where that set of flaws they have is not that big a deal to you because doesn't have any deal breakers. It doesn't make you unhappy, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think one person's flaws are another person's like benefits or pros. There was an episode, I think it was an episode of How I Met Your Mother I saw one time that put this really well, where it's like, there are some quirks about a person that might really irk you, but to someone else, those quirks are actually really endearing and lovable. And so it's kind of taking your mom's advice one step further, not only being, you don't find someone whose flaws you don't mind, but more actually find someone who like someone else thinks they have flaws, but to you, you would love those things about them.
It sounds like one thing you're emphasizing is that getting into a relationship sooner has benefits. Like you get to enjoy that relationship for longer. And also, you can avoid the stress of looking. Is that right?
Absolutely. And again, depends on the person. Some people might know they never want to be in a long-term relationship. Some people might know they always want to keep dating. Some people might not want to be monogamous. All those people might have different models, and that's totally fine. But I think for the type of person who knows they want to get married, which again, I think is the majority of people, according to most survey data, the sooner you can get to the point where you feel like the relationship is serious, the sooner you will learn the things about serious relationships that will set you up for success, such as how to be a good partner, how to reap those benefits of commitment.
It seems to me that especially if people want to have kids, that there's value in trying to finding that partner early because it makes it easier from especially if you want to have multiple kids, it makes it easier just from a biological level.
Absolutely. And I think similarly, a lot of people say that they want to have kids in the future, but they quote unquote don't put their money where their mouth is, meaning they don't prioritize the steps that it takes to get there. The first step for most people being to find that long-term partner. And so I just want to be careful here because I know that everyone has totally different opinions on this topic and a lot of their moral values play into it. And so I definitely don't want to impose my own values. I'm hoping that nobody can even guess what they are, although maybe they can. It's more like if you say you're the kind of person who I want to get married, I want to have kids, you may not have as much time as you think you do, in part because of that biological ticking clock that applies primarily to women. And so there's nothing you can do to guarantee that you're going to have the outcome you want on the timeline that you want, but the best thing you can do to maximize your chances is to take that entire process seriously and commit to trying to find that commitment.
Switching topics now, let's jump into financial skills. What's an example of a financial skill you think people don't learn often or don't learn early enough?
There are many, but I just mentioned paying taxes. It's actually crazy to me. You are required by law to pay your taxes. If you don't do it, the penalties escalate up into the point that you can actually go to jail. And yet, nobody ever teaches you in a public education system how to pay your taxes.
Is it one of those things, though, where everyone kind of figures it out anyway?
Well, many people don't figure it out because they either never pay their taxes or they never do it properly or they outsource it to an accountant. I don't think there's anything wrong with outsourcing it to an accountant. It may be worth it if it's not worth your time to learn or to do it properly, and plenty of people do that, and that could make sense. But I think there are a bunch of problems with kind of assuming you're going to do that from the outset. The first one is you may not be able to afford it, right? It's a lot cheaper to do your own taxes, and so you may not be in a financial position you can pay an accountant forever. Second is you just won't learn how the system works and therefore how to make certain optimizations to the way you live to save you on taxes. I think a lot of people don't realize in the long term how much taxes eat out of your long-term net worth. And therefore, some small adjustments you can make to the ways in which you live and earn and pay and so forth can save you a lot of money. And so I find that every year when I do my own taxes, and I say do my own with air quotes that you can't see because I use TurboTax, but TurboTax is still walking you through step by step. I notice hey, if I'd done this thing differently, I would have actually saved money at the end of the year. And every year I learn new things like that.
So when do you think people ideally would learn how to do their taxes? Because I'm imagining if there was a class on doing your taxes in ninth grade, pretty much no way I would have retained any of that to today.
Absolutely. I think it's most useful the moment that you have to do it. And so when I talk about in general, teaching adulting skills, I think they're most useful to teach when people have to actually start doing them because then the knowledge feels more urgent.
So maybe you could just give us a little taste. What are some things that people should know about doing their taxes that maybe they don't know?
So one of them is about credits versus deductions. A lot of people get these terms confused. So I'm going to try to explain it in over audio, even though normally it visually helps. A deduction is saying that this we're deducting this amount from my income. So let's say I earn $50,000 and I donate $1,000 to charity. I can deduct that $1,000 from my income for tax purposes, which means I'm only going to be taxed on the remaining $49,000. And let's assume my tax rate, just to keep it very simple, is 10%. That means I'm going to have to pay $4,900 in taxes. But if I hadn't donated to charity, I would have had to pay $5,000. So that deduction was worth 10% of the amount that I deducted. So that $1,000 donation saved me, quote unquote, $100 on my taxes. A credit means you actually don't pay the taxes on that amount. If you get a credit on something, it means that, let's say a credit of $1,000, you actually get $1,000 back clean, not 10% of it on your taxes. And so these laws change all the time, and so I'm not exactly sure what they are this year. But there was a year in the past where for childcare, you could do a deduction or a credit. Obviously, the credit is better. It can be worth 10 times, up to 10 times as much. But you kind of had to figure out, do I take the credit on this amount? Do I take the deduction on that amount? And so understanding that distinction that year, I think saved me a couple $1,000s.
Oh, nice. I do see people confused on this a lot. For instance, I often have seen people accuse billionaires of oh, well, they just gave to charity because it saved them money on taxes. And you're no, there's no way that wasn't a huge net loss, that donation.
Yeah, it basically means if their marginal tax rate was 50% all in, that includes all the federal and state and local taxes they have to pay. I think 50% is basically the upper limit in the US. That would mean that the donation only cost them about half as much as what they actually paid because the other half could be deducted from their taxes.
Exactly. So they still lost money. It's just they lost less than they would have without the tax deduction.
Sorry, yeah, to clarify, they would deduct the entire amount from their taxes, but half of that would be money back to them because half that is what they would have paid in taxes.
Right. Very interesting. Any other kind of tidbits on taxes that you think people should be aware of?
Tax is the most boring topic. In my book, I walk it through the entire form step by step, which I think is a much better way to do it because then you see every question that you're asked and how to answer it. But I think the most helpful thing I wish I'd have known is that you have to save your records for up to 7 years. Because the IRS, which is the federal agency in charge of collecting revenue, meaning that does the taxes, they can request information for you going back 7 years. They say, even though you submitted your taxes for 2024, there's something you did in 2018 that we're not sure about. Can you show us the W-2 that you still have or something like that? And if you don't have it, you could get in trouble or you would have to be audited or one of those things could happen. And so I actually, way too late in my life, started keeping a literal filing cabinet of all these forms that I have going way back into the past.
Do you have an idea for a digital product that could improve the world? Are you frustrated by cookie-cutter survey platforms that don't give you the level of personalization you need for your research content? GuidedTrack might be what you're looking for. GuidedTrack will empower you to effortlessly create and launch apps, surveys, educational modules, prototypes, and online tools, even if you have no programming experience. From Ayla's famous Kink survey to the quiz called Can You Guess Which Studies Replicate, made by 80,000 Hours, GuidedTrack's easy-to-use platform and flexible interface has enabled some of the most creative people and organizations to bring their impactful ideas to life. In fact, it's what we've used to build all 70 of Clearer Thinking's interactive digital tools. To make it even easier for you to embark on your next project, we've recently launched 10 free templates. Simply choose the template that aligns best with your goals and customize the content as needed. But you want to know what the best part is? GuidedTrack is completely free to use. So visit guidedtrack.com to sign up for your free account and start making your next big thing.
What about IRAs? I feel like that's a huge topic that people don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely. A big question that people ask is, should I invest in a Roth IRA or a traditional IRA because they're taxed differently? I think in order to understand that, you have to rewind a lot to understand not only what is an IRA, but how do tax advantage retirement accounts work in general. But even why does a tax advantage retirement account matter? What is a retirement account? Why even investing? What is investing and how does it work? Is it okay if we rewind all the way to that?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
The other, I think, big secret that people don't tell you is that if you don't save money for your retirement, you will likely not have enough money to retire on. There is a social security system in the US, but it doesn't provide for most people enough for them to live comfortably. And so they have to supplement that with their own savings. And of course, that could get worse over time because there's all kinds of talk about how social security benefits might be cut or even eliminated by the time that our generation is retired. So you have to save your own money. It seems like a lot of money, right? Let's say you want to retire at age 65 and you hope to live to age 90. That means you have to have at least 25 years worth of living expenses saved up. It's hard enough to save up 1 year of living expenses. How do you do that? Well, there's this magical thing called investing, which ends up meaning you don't have to save as much money as you think you do because the small amount that you save can accumulate over time. And so investing just means saving money in a way that's going to earn you more money over time. A very basic example of investing is if you put money into a bank account, it earns you interest. Most people are probably familiar with that. That is a form of investing. You put in $100. If it earns 5% interest, every year getting $5 added to your bank account. And that $5 compounds, meaning every year now, not only you're earning interest on the first $100, you're also earning interest on the $5 and then interest on that and so forth. And so the amount that you're earning every year grows. That's compounding. It's essentially exponential growth. And so there are other forms of investing too. Most people are commonly thinking of investing in the stock market. And so it's putting your money in a way that's going to earn you more money over time so that it's much more affordable or easier to save for your retirement.
Now, a lot of financial gurus will say things like you should put a fixed percentage of your income into your investments, automatically every month. Is that what you would advocate as well?
It really depends on the person, their situation. I typically offer a multi-pronged sort of approach for what to do with your money before you get to the point in which you could take that money and spend it on something like leisure. And so some of those steps include getting insurance that's necessary to protect yourself, building up some emergency savings, and at some point, yes, investing that money and probably investing it into a tax advantage retirement account. And so I can try to answer that question now about IRAs, which is when you invest money, it's going to grow over time. That growth is going to be compounded, but taxes eat away at that compound growth because you're going to have to pay a portion of your gains every year back to the government in the form of taxes. And so the government has some carve-outs you can use. They're called retirement accounts and that are tax advantaged. So they have certain tax benefits. Some types of accounts are not taxed at all until you withdraw the money. Some are taxed when you put the money in, but then their growth is not taxed. It gets sort of confusing. But the ultimate purpose of them is if you know that you are going to be saving this money for your retirement and not using it sooner, you might as well put it into one of these investment vehicles so that the taxes won't eat away at the growth.
And it can make a really huge difference, right? Whether you put money in an IRA or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we're talking about saving money over the course of your lifetime for retirement, I've done calculations, depends on the person, their income, but it could save you hundreds of thousands of dollars, up to $500,000 in your total savings, whether you remember or not to put the money into one of these tax advantage accounts. I was about to say the one that probably most people are familiar with is a 401k. It's a kind of IRA that's provided by your employer.
So you mentioned the stock market. Is that what you think people should be doing with their savings when they know they're not going to touch it for a while?
For the most part, it tends to be the best way to invest. And I think I should clarify what I mean by the stock market. So people can obviously pick individual stocks, Amazon, Apple, whatever, but they can also invest into an index fund like an S&P 500 fund that tracks the 500 largest companies. And what's interesting about that is an index fund tends to smooth out the volatility of individual stocks. So some years Amazon may go up, Apple may go down, but if you've diversified between the two, you kind of benefit from that like hedged risk. And so the S&P 500 index fund itself can carry its own level of risk, because obviously there's some years the entire stock market goes down. People remember 2008, 2009. The entire S&P 500 as a whole went down because the average company went down in value. And that is the risk of investing. Your money may not grow. It might actually depreciate over time. But in order to determine, is the S&P 500 a worthwhile investment, I think it's worth looking at long time horizons. And this is an analysis that I've done. I haven't seen other people do, so it might be worth explaining, of basically how risky is it to put your money in the S&P 500 over a long period of time.
Right, because that's I think that's the thing that scares people, right? Like, yes, the stock market on average has done really well, but what if for 7 years it does dismally badly, and then you just don't have nearly as much money for your living expenses?
Absolutely. And so I got data from an economist that goes back about 150 years of the U.S. total stock market, essentially like the S&P 500, but it's even more comprehensive. And so what I did was look at the returns over different bands of time. So as a basic example, let's take the band of 1 year. The best possible case of how much your money could have returned over 1 year, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's somewhere around 50%, meaning you could have earned 50% on the money you put in. The worst case is negative 40-something%. It could have lost almost 50% of its value. I think that was if you put your money in like 1931, withdrew in 1932 sometime during the Great Depression. I don't remember the exact year. That's the worst case. Okay, but what if we expand the time horizon to 5 years? What is the best case growth for 5 years and the worst case growth for 5 years? It gets a little bit narrower. I don't remember the exact numbers, but something best case is 20-something%, worst case is negative 20-something%. And so as you say, I'm going to invest my money for longer and longer periods of time, that range of possible returns gets narrower and narrower, down to the point where you're saying, I'm going to invest this money for 30 years. So put it in today, not touch it for 30 years. What's the worst possible case? The worst case is it appreciates by about 6%. And the best case is it appreciates by about 11%. And that's based on 150 years of history.
Yeah, that's really cool. Now, of course, we don't know about the future. The future could be different than the past. You know, maybe all civilization will get destroyed and there will be no stock market. But it's really cool. Though, to see that as you aggregate to longer and longer time frames, the confidence level that you'll be appreciating capital, not losing it, goes up and up. And
not only appreciating, but appreciating at a 6 to 11% range, which is pretty incredible when you do the calculations on how much that can compound. That risk you mentioned is very real, right? It's always possible this 150-year trend won't continue. Empires have fallen in the past. I just like to remind people that 150 years of history does include the Great Depression and includes 2 world wars, September 11th, and everything in between. Right.
So we got a lot of stress testing, at least. Do you advocate that people invest internationally?
Not in particular. I haven't seen much evidence that it's better than the U.S. economy. In fact, it seems like it might be worse. But I've only done this analysis on the U.S. economy.
You know, if you read the prospectuses of any kind of investment vehicle, they'll always say past performance does not imply future performance, and they kind of have to say that. But to what extent do you think that is really true?
I think it's extremely true, and all the evidence I've seen supports it. So there are cases where you can have a fund manager beating the index, like performing better than the S&P 500 for 1 year, 2 year, 3 years in a row, and they're no more likely to beat it in the 4th year than any other any other fund manager picked out of a hat. And so past performance does not indicate future performance, no matter how long your track record is, according to the studies that I've seen, which is pretty amazing. It basically means that nobody can consistently beat the average being the S&P 500, so might as well invest in it.
It seems to me, though, that there are funds that have clearly beat the average systematically, like Renaissance Technologies being the famous example, where they've, if I'm not mistaken, they've beaten the average of the stock market by like 40 or 50% a year for like easily over 25 years. So to me, that seems like impossible to happen by chance, but they're obviously a crazy outlier. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by Renaissance Technologies. I love them as an example for that reason. What's interesting is, and it's probably a caveat I should add to the claim I made earlier, these are all publicly accessible funds that like the average Joe Schmo can actually invest their money in. So the original RenTech fund, if I understand correctly, is closed to the public. It's actually only a lot of the original owners and employees who have access to it. And all the other funds that they've started since then on the side have not actually outperformed on average. And part of the reason for that is kind of like the way that their quantitative trading algorithm works. It's kind of capped by like how much they can trade. So they don't actually want to raise more money for that fund because it might affect their performance.
Yeah, I think it's such a good example for that reason. That, yeah, my understanding is they kicked out their investors ultimately or maybe they allowed a small number of investors to maintain and they just filled it with their own money because imagine you had this money-making machine. Would you really want other people to use it, or you just want to use it yourself, right?
I think that's one explanation, but I think the other explanation is actually that it won't work if there's too much money, because some of the trades they're making, I don't know what they actually are, but just as a hypothetical example, if they're trading on some commodity like in Zimbabwe, and they're trading literally the size of that entire market in one day, like there's not more that they can physically buy up of it.
No, that's exactly right. Because if it had unlimited capacity, then you might as well trade it yourself for your own money and let other people use it. But no, you're absolutely right. It's limited capacity. My understanding is that actually they give back a lot of money to investors every year because they can't grow it. And so and you're absolutely also right that the much larger funds that they've released that are open to a much broader swath of the public haven't done nearly as well as their flagship fund.
And one thing that I find amazing is that everything we're saying about Renaissance technology was once true of index funds, like these S&P 500 index funds. They were not open to the public. They were kind of very tricky to get into. You had to have a certain amount of money and so forth. And one of the big innovations in finance, and I think this was the early 1970s, was making one of these funds, John Bogle, who started Vanguard, accessible to your average retirement investor, just someone who's putting their money away for retirement. I often like this question of like, what are the wonders of the modern world? You know, with the 7 wonders of the ancient world. I think one of the wonders of the modern world is a publicly accessible index fund, because it's basically democratized access to this prosperity of the stock market.
Let's switch categories and talk about career skills, because this is something that almost everyone has to face multiple times in their life and has such a big impact on what they spend a lot of their time in their life doing, right? What your job is one of the biggest sources of your efforts and time.
Yeah, the way that I try to describe it to someone who is just starting out in their career is you actually have 2 jobs. The first job is what you're doing all day, trying to succeed in your job. And the second one is figuring out what the heck you want to do with the rest of your career. And that often takes as much time, or at least is worth putting as much time into, as your day job. It takes a lot of exploration of talking to different people and reaching out and networking and trying different things so that you can determine, am I in the right place, or do I want to move to somewhere else that's going to advance my career? I think that a lot of people don't put that amount of thought into the very first full-time job they take, either because they don't know enough because they're coming out of college, or they just don't have the time to do it. But once you're in that first full-time job, a lot of people start to realize this may not be right for me. What else do I want to do? And that second job of figuring it out is a huge time commitment.
You know, it's so tricky because if someone feels like they're coming from a place of weakness where they're like, okay, well, I just need to get a job, right? I'm just looking for someone who's willing to hire me. It feels probably difficult to then think about what they're trying to do long-term, or what their long-term goals are, because they're merely just trying to, put food on the table.
Absolutely. And I think that's why I try to describe it as having a second job, because if you don't have a job at all, you have one job, which is to find a job, because most people need the income. Once you have that job and you have the income, you now have the ability, but also in some ways the impetus, to figure out if you should find a job that's going to be more advancing of your career in the future. And one of the reasons that matters, it obviously matters for a ton of reasons, including your own personal fulfillment, but just from a financial standpoint, you can agonize over picking different investments. And we talked about the S&P 500 versus picking stocks and so forth. But even getting a raise of $1,000 at work that sticks with you over the course of your career, like your income is permanently $1,000 higher and growing, it makes more of a difference than a 1% return on your investments that you're putting towards your retirement for most people. And so figuring out a job where you can get paid more matters a lot more than agonizing over your investments. And I think in the long term, the way to find the jobs that are going to pay you the most are to find the ones that align the most with your unique superpowers.
Yeah, so could you unpack that a bit more, aligning the most with your unique superpowers?
Yeah, everyone has strengths and weaknesses. And I think what I learned early on in my career is that smoothing over my weaknesses might help my career a little bit, but not nearly as much as leaning into my strengths. Pretty much every successful person I've met has figured out what is it that they're uniquely talented at better than all of their peers, and tried to make that into their entire job. Because just if you think about the market, the job market is one giant, competitive environment. You're going to outcompete if you find your niche. And everyone has a niche. It's just the niche might be really hard to figure out, because your niche may not be, I'm the best writer. It might be, I'm the best writer at this very specific type of thing. And you have to figure out what that is. Or some people's niche might be a combination of 3 different superpowers. Like, I'm really good at explaining things, and I'm really good at talking to people, and I'm really good at convincing people. And like, that might be, you end up being a salesperson or a politician or something like that. And so I think that the faster that you can figure out what your superpowers are, the faster you can find a job that takes advantage of them, and in the long term is going to maximize your earning potential and your personal fulfillment.
I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it. Although I will say that sometimes I feel that people have a superpower, but it's not being unleashed because of some weakness. Like they're an incredible writer, but they seem to not have the discipline to write daily. And so they only write 3 things a year or whatever that they get done, or they agonize over, their latest article. So I'm just wondering how you think sort of weaknesses fit into that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say to ignore your weaknesses completely because, like you're saying, if they serve as a blocker, it might be worth trying to overcome them. But it also, in your example, might turn out that no matter how hard you try, even if you spent your entire life, you cannot overcome that weakness of not having enough discipline to sit down and write for 4 hours a day. And then maybe you shouldn't become a writer because writing is not truly your superpower. If it was, you wouldn't have that weakness going with it. And so I think that weaknesses should be worked on to the extent that they feel like they're really inhibiting you and blocking you from unleashing your full potential. But your full potential is on the side of those superpowers, not on the side of like being a perfectly well-rounded person who doesn't have weaknesses.
It's interesting how school tries to get us to be well-rounded. Often it makes us study a wide variety of subjects and it grades us on each of them equally and kind of averages the score. And it's like, well, in life, it actually is much more important that you're really good at some things, not that you're able to do, on average, well across a huge range of disciplines.
Yeah, I think there's benefit to that for sure, right? In other school systems like Germany and France, they have you specialize early. And I think it has pros and cons because you might argue that when you're a child or even a teenager, you still need to be exploring these other things to figure out if they're a superpower or not. There's some people who are bad at math in 4th grade, but start getting better at it when the math gets more abstract, like in geometry. And so I'm not exactly sure what's the right age to start doing that. But I think what does feel obvious to me is that by the time you're in a full-time job, when you're 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, those ages, like, yes, by now you have enough maturity, enough brain development to basically be able to start trying things and get a sense of whether or not they're truly a superpower. And so in that sense, you want to force yourself into as many niches as possible to see if they're working for you.
Yeah, I agree. It's good to expose young kids to a lot of different things. I just mean that the evaluation metric is evaluating you across all of them, which can give you the sense that that's how you're successful in life, is by being good on average at a super wide range of things.
Exactly. If only grading was more like a strengths assessment where it could say, well, what we've determined from this exam is not that you're like an A student or a B student. We've determined that you're an A plus student when it comes to these things and you're a D student when it comes to these other things. And maybe you should orient your career more towards the A things.
So what do you think people can do to approach finding a job more effectively?
I think the first step is to realize that most hirings don't happen based on job postings. There's some study that was done on this of how many jobs are actually like they hire the person because they saw a job posting and applied versus how many were done through a lot more informal process. And the latter happens more frequently. And so I don't think it means that there's some vast conspiracy or some shady underbelly where it's all about being elite and being connected. It just means that a lot of the times the best way to get jobs is to establish relationships with people and get to know them, especially in industries where you want to end up working. And so when I was younger, I would say I hated networking. Even the word itself kind of made me like uncomfortable, like gave me a little bit of a gag reflex because it felt so uncomfortable. But I changed my attitude towards networking, and I think that helped a lot. In the past, I thought it was like, you have to go to these fancy events and shake hands with people and drink cocktails. But I realized it's actually just exploring the things you're curious about by talking to interesting people. And so if you think, even if this is a distant thought in the back of your mind, like, hey, I might want to be a graphic designer one day, that seems cool, you can let that linger in your head. Or you can say, I'm just going to try to find a graphic designer who I really like, and I can try to talk to them and learn more about like their talents and where they come from and what they think about their work and so forth. And you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. One is you're figuring out what that job really means and whether or not it's actually appealing to you. And second, you're starting to network, to meet people who work in that space. And so what I suggest that young people do is basically look at what are your jobs that, at least on paper, seem the coolest to you. Go on LinkedIn, find some people who have those jobs, reach out to them, try to have a conversation. And the point of the conversation doesn't need to be extremely like have a point that you're trying to get something out of them. It's more like just to learn about them and ask some questions. And those people are happy to talk about themselves and tell you about their work and their lives. At the end of the conversation, say, if it's true, say, this was great. Are there 2 other people I should talk to who'd be interesting to me? And then your network starts growing exponentially.
One thing I find really useful at networking events is to focus on meeting a bunch of people there, but not lingering with people that I don't vibe with, right? So it's like, okay, I want to meet 10 people at this event, but I'm really looking for the people where I feel we have a vibe. And then, okay, if there's some way that we might be able to benefit each other from the point of view of business or whatever, that's great. But I'm not going to like stay in a conversation with someone where we're just not gelling just because, oh, well, maybe there's some kind of possible, business advantage.
Absolutely. I think of it similarly to how we were talking about dating and going to parties. Like for an introvert like me who doesn't intrinsically enjoy parties with lots of people, If the purpose of the party is to make new friends or find a potential romantic partner, the purpose is to meet that person, kind of do the best you can with the conversation if there's loud music playing or whatnot. But then eventually in the business world, you say take that conversation offline, mean follow up with that person later and find an opportunity to actually get to know them. And so I'd say the same thing about a networking event. I personally have never liked those. And to me, the purpose is always find the people you might click with so you can then follow up with them and build a relationship with them.
Yeah, because realistically, usually you're going to have to build a relationship anyway for that to be a valuable connection in many cases. And so you sort of have to have that underlying, oh, I like this person and I want to get to know them better.
Yeah. My recommendation is to follow your curiosity. I mean, that's what I do. If someone doesn't feel interesting to you, then I think there's a limited amount of time for which you can fake that you're interested in them. And it's more like if someone seems like, wow, this person's fascinating, or what they do interest me, you're like, there's more that I want to learn from them. Then when you follow your nose on those things, one person will lead to another person. Eventually, you'll have a network in a space that actually excites you.
It also seems to me that networking in a positive sense is something that really takes years to develop. It's not something you can do quickly. It sort of has to be a sort of longer term endeavor.
Yes and no. I think that's definitely true for building an entire career. Like your network will grow over time and that exponential growth will pay off the most when it's later on. But I also think people find that their networking leads to opportunities much faster than they'd expect. I think about this in the context of just like my own childhood. I moved a lot, and every 2 years or so on average, my family would move and I'd have to make new friends. I found that it always felt like it took about a year to feel like I had new friends. And that entire first year, it felt like I was almost getting nowhere, right? Like I was trying to, get to know someone or kind of break into like a social group or something like that. And it was just like I was lonely. And then the 1 year mark would hit, be like, oh, now I actually have friends and like solid friends or multiple friends or something like that. And my observations of working with young people, it seems like that tends to happen. Maybe the timeline is similar. It's about a year. It feels like you're kind of not making any headway. And then suddenly you look back, you're like, oh, I made a lot of headway. In just a span of 1 year, these connections can start to help you.
What about the topic of figuring out what you want to do with your life? We've talked about looking for your superpowers, but what are other aspects of that you think are important?
I think the biggest one comes from this field in psychology called adult development. And the theory goes that just as children go through developmental stages, adults do as well. However, unlike children, the developmental stages of adults are not tied to certain ages. So even though, most 2-year-olds can start forming words and sentences, some adults may never graduate from one stage to another unless they put in the conscious work to make that transformation happen. And the reason I bring this up is there's a key transformation in this theory where people go from one step to another. The first step is called the socialized mind, and the next one is the self-authored mind. The socialized mind is the stage that actually most adults are in, where you are primarily living your life according to what you think other people expect you to do. You have all these ingrained beliefs that come from what your parents told you when you were young, your teachers, your peers, now that you're a grown-up, what your peers think of you, your bosses, and so forth. And you have this internal compass, and most of the time that internal compass is actually wired towards the direction of some kind of Frankenstein version of all those people and their expectations, or at least what you think they are. The self-authored mind is graduating from that and determining for yourself where the compass should point and going through this critical examination process of like, where did these beliefs that I have actually come from? Who said them to me? Do I still agree with them? What is the evidence in favor or against me? Continuing to believe in them and then coming to the conclusion of this is what I actually want from my career or my relationship or my life. And if you don't go through that process, you might continue living your whole life according to this weird Frankenstein monster of everyone else's expectations. So I think that framework can very much apply to someone's career of saying, I always wanted to be a doctor. Well, why did you want to be a doctor? Is it because you admired a doctor when you were younger? Is it because your parents told you should become a doctor? Is it because one of your friends said, I think doctors are so hot and I'd want to sleep with one? There are a million possible reasons that could have led you to believe that. And when you examine the belief, you might determine, I actually have good reasons for believing it. Like, yes, the first thing came to me because my parents said I should be, but then I realized, I do really love working with people and I really love science and medicine and so forth. Or you might realize, no, there's actually no good reason to be a doctor. I should be something else.
It seems to me that social influence works in this very subtle way where we're often not aware when we're socially influenced. It just feels like, oh, I want that thing or I like that thing. And you don't realize, oh, no, I like it because other people like it. I want it because my friends want it.
Exactly. A belief is a belief. What I mean by that is it's very hard, unless you put in the conscious effort, to be aware of where your beliefs came from and to know if they're a belief that was influenced by other people's expectations or a belief that came about through your own process that's true to you and your ultimate purpose. And so if you don't take the time to pick apart these beliefs, at least every once in a while, you're at risk of following, for your example, like just social influences.
I like to go back to values with regard to this kind of thing where you think about, well, what do I really deeply, fundamentally value? And then make sure that your long-term goals are aligned with those values so that you don't spend years and years pursuing this goal, only get to the end of it and be like, wait a minute, I don't actually care about this thing that much.
I've read about your moral system based on intrinsic values, and I really like it. I think that a lot of these things can actually be complementary, and I'd encourage people who follow that system to do the same process to the values themselves. If you think that one of your intrinsic values is, belief in God or not causing harm, or I'm sorry if I'm butchering them, I don't remember exactly what they are, but to really ask yourself, like, where did that intrinsic value come from? Like, how intrinsic is it? Was it because my parents raised me that way? And if it is because my parents raised me that way, does it still feel true to me?
Right. So I would distinguish between things that really are your intrinsic value, regardless of where they came from, whether it's through genetics or upbringing or culture or whatever, versus when you're living by other people's values. So if because when you were, 3 to 12 years old, certain ideas were impressed on you and that ended up leading to a certain intrinsic value as an adult, I would respect that intrinsic value, even though it happened to come from your culture, because, well, everything about us came from somewhere, right? It either came from our genetics or our culture or our upbringing, right? It's like we didn't self-create our values. I just don't think that's the way values work. However, I would differentiate that from you don't really have that value, but your friends have your value, your parents have that value. And so you're trying to seek this thing that's not your value, it's someone else's value.
I think that's right. And to your point about everything at some point came from culture or genetics or some combination of the two, that's probably true. But to me, the question is, have you examined it or not? Right? Like, it's much more likely that the belief is something that you want to follow if you've taken the time to question it and figure out where it came from and ask these questions, versus if you don't, you're just much more at risk of drifting along.
Another key aspect of career skills is negotiation, right? You're going to have to negotiate details of a job, your pay, all kinds of things. What are some tips you give around that?
I think that some people approach negotiation the wrong way because of how they've seen it done in movies, where it's like one person says a high number, another person says a low number, and then they keep going back and forth, and it's kind of this like hard charging contest of wills. There's an economist named Barry Nailbuff who says that a lot of people have this stereotype and it's wrong. And usually what negotiating is about figuring out how you can expand the size of the pie. It's often less of a zero-sum game than people think, and not, if I take a slice, you'll have less pie, and more like, what are the things we can add to the pie to make it mutually beneficial for both of us? And I think the same thing is true if you're negotiating, as an example, a raise from your boss. Unless you have some kind of adversarial relationship with your boss, which I know happens, but let's assume it's not the case. Your boss often wants to support you. Their life will be better if you're doing better work, and you'll do better work if you're more motivated. And so in an ideal world, if they could, they'd pay you $1 million and make you super happy so that you'll do the best possible work for them. But they can't pay you $1 million because they have to follow their own budget constraints or the wishes of their own boss. And so then it becomes this more collaborative effort of how do we work together to come up with a compensation amount that makes me motivated enough and that doesn't break your budget. In practice, I recognize it's really hard to be that open about something like salaries or budgets, especially if you're very junior on a team. That might come across the wrong way. And so instead, there's like a series of tactics I recommend for how to approach the conversation that kind of get at that underlying idea of expanding the size of the pie.
So what are some of those tactics?
So one of them is to start by telling your boss what your intention is. Similar to how I talked about approaching difficult conversations. If you come in and your boss has the impression you're young, you're inexperienced, you're feeling very entitled and you just want more money because your entire generation is lazy and wants more money, that's very different from coming in and saying, I really like this work and I want to do better work. And part of the way I can do better work is by having more money to outsource more things in my life. Or if I can order dinner more times in a week, then I'll be able to stay later in the office more times in a week. That line of thinking could be dangerous if you don't want to be working later and so forth. But the general principle there that I'm using the example to try to illustrate is if you show your boss, I do care about this job. I do want to work hard. I do want to be deserving of a raise or promotion. Let's talk about how I can get there. It establishes that shared intention. If we're on the same team, we're trying to figure out the best approach for your compensation rather than you're trying to squeeze more money out of me and I'm trying to squeeze less money out of you.
Right. So taking a very non-adversarial approach.
Exactly. Another technique is to demonstrate that you've already started doing the work of the next level up. So for example, if you have some mandate at your job, which is to write the marketing materials for 3 campaigns, and most people who are a senior associate handle 3 campaigns plus another client, just making these things up, then you could say, I've already started doing that. I already have started taking on another client or something like that, or I've demonstrated that I'm capable of doing that. And so really what you're doing by giving me this raise or this promotion is not giving me some new amount of responsibility. It's just recognizing what I've already taken on. And so I say the best possible thing you can say in a negotiation, or even as a line to put on your resume, is saying, I was tasked with doing X and I accomplished X plus Y. And you typically pay people who do X plus Y more, so let's just formalize it and put that down.
When you think about negotiating with a boss, do you think about it as justifying that you deserve that amount, or do you frame it fundamentally in a different way? Because I think some people will come in and say, look, usually you pay people who do X plus Y this amount. I'm doing X plus Y, therefore I deserve to make this extra amount. But yeah, so I wonder, is that an effective framing for your point of view of like framing it as I deserve this because I'm doing this thing?
I'd be very careful about using that word because I think it could rub people the wrong way, especially given the current environment where I think a lot of, let's say, older people think that younger people feel entitled. And so if you say, I deserve this amount, it could really make it feel like coming from a place of entitlement rather than a place of that like collaboration. As an aside, I think that word itself can be harmful if you're kind of letting it immerse in your thinking too much. Like if you have this attitude of, I deserve A, B, and C, you're more likely setting yourself up for disappointment in life. I think the hard truth is that basically nobody deserves anything just by virtue of being born. I would like to live in a world in which everyone is loved and taken care of and has everything they need, and that's great, and I think people should strive to take care of each other. But in real life, just by virtue of being born, there's basically nothing that you deserve. And so if instead you basically say, I'm going to go through life with this attitude of, I want these things, and I'm going to try to do what I can so that I can get them, you're going to be a lot less disappointed if you don't get them than if you say, I deserved it and I didn't get it, because that could lead you to think the world is unfair or you don't have an agency or things like that.
Have you heard about the Clearer Thinking Cognitive Assessment? It's a research-backed test that we created to help you understand your intellectual strengths and weaknesses. And it goes beyond the standard IQ measurement to help you get to know 7 different aspects of your thinking. Right after completing the cognitive assessment, you'll receive a detailed report outlining your strengths and areas for growth, along with tailored insights and recommendations for education, career path, and self-improvement. Please note that, unlike most of our other tools, this assessment is a paid tool. All proceeds directly support Clearer Thinking's research and mission. To take the assessment now or to learn more about the research and reasoning behind its development, visit clearerthinking.org/cognitive. That's clearerthinking.org/cognitive.
You mentioned a few minutes ago about this idea of looking for other elements in a negotiation that you can give to the other party, right? So, people often think of negotiations in terms of a single item being negotiated, right? Like you're just negotiating pay and you can either get paid more, in which case you win, or you can get paid less, in which case they win, right? But the reality is often there are multiple elements in these negotiations. Maybe pay kind of focuses on one variable. But let's say you're taking on a new job, you're just about to get hired. There are a lot of different things to negotiate over, right? There's, maybe there's benefits, pay, vacation, so on, right? And I think one of the really interesting factors in negotiations is that you and the other party might care different amounts about these different factors, and that leads to a lot of opportunity.
Absolutely. So some of the factors you could put on the table are other forms of pay like benefits, which is essentially being paid in another way. How much you do or don't have to travel, depending on your preferences, or work remotely. I think another big one is just how many growth opportunities you have. Unless you're in a very dire financial circumstance, it's probably best to think about your early career as, how do I maximize the long-term earning potential that I have? Because of compound growth, it's going to pay off more in the long run to gain some growth opportunity than to just try to squeeze another $1,000 for the year out of my boss. And so with that attitude, you can say, I'm willing to take this lower salary you offer me, but what I really want to do is try to level up as quickly as possible. And so I request that you bring me to more senior meetings or let me travel with you or things like that. I think A, that would impress a prospective employer, and B, more importantly, might actually give you those opportunities. And so to try to explain that better, I'd say one of those other things you could put on the table is asking for more opportunities to learn and to grow faster.
Before we wrap up, I want to cover the 4th category that you mentioned, which is mental skills. What's one of the big mental skills that you feel people really need to learn?
One of them is critical thinking. There's this saying that is sometimes called Sturgeon's Law, which is 90% of everything you hear or read is total BS. Anecdotally, from my own life, I guess I felt like Sturgeon's Law has been true. Just people write and say a lot of stuff, and most of it is kind of made up or kind of not really true. And so if you don't build yourself a mind that's critical and skeptical, you're at risk of just believing all kinds of things that are going to, give you an incorrect worldview or set you up for failure in life. And so I think cultivating a healthy amount of skepticism, in other words, becoming a critical thinker, can make you a lot happier in life. And so there's a process for assimilating new information that I try to go through, which is I first try to understand what something is saying. Like, is the message of this movie that I'm watching that I should do, this kind of thing with my relationship or that kind of thing. Once you understand what the message is, you say like, oh, it was actually worming its way into my mind. Song lyrics do this a lot, right? Where you just be listening to a happy pop song a lot, and then you start to realize like, oh, wait, the song is actually conveying this belief or this value system. Once you understand it, then you can examine it and say, do I actually agree with this? Do I not agree with it? Why or why not? It's for that reason that I tend to at least read nonfiction, very slowly, because I feel like every single sentence you read is making some claim about the world or the way people work. And if you don't stop to think about it and say, do I agree? Do I disagree? Why or why not? How else would that change my views? Then you're at risk of just unconsciously assimilating the information, and then you end up with a mind that's full of all kind of clutter that was never examined and therefore is likely to be untrue.
I think about this in the way that people word articles. Like, imagine a wording like, and the CEO told us that he had fired 100 employees versus the CEO admitted that he fired 100 employees, right? It's such a different vibe, just the slight wording difference of told us versus admitted. And yet, journalists and writers are doing these kinds of things all the time, often subconsciously, but the word choice really influences what we take away from things.
Absolutely. I think it's so prevalent in media. Sometimes the journalists have an agenda because they're trying to get people to like or dislike the CEO. Sometimes it's just unconscious on their part, but to your point, it still impacts how people interpret the message. I think this happens even more so from music and movies and just all the things that we do for entertainment. Like, movies and music have at their core the people who wrote the lyrics or the screenplays, and those people have certain values and beliefs about the world, and those are bleeding into the stories that they're telling. And I think most people derive a lot of their ways of living from stories and from songs without really thinking about it. And so I think what you're in the worst case at risk of doing is basically following a belief system that really works for very successful writers in Hollywood or the entertainment industry, and doesn't actually work for most people.
So with regard to critical thinking, once you've kind of figured out what the message is, what else do you do to think critically about the content?
The way I describe it is as a metaphor that looks like your mind is like a Brita filter. And so you pour the water in, the information gets filtered through. You examine what's true, what you think is not true, and then what goes down into your jug of clean, pure water is the filtered information. But if you take in information too quickly, if you've ever tried to pour water too fast at the top of a Brita filter, it overflows to the top. Some of it goes down the spout and mixes. So you're mixing unfiltered water into the filtered water. And then you end up with dirty water in your jug, meaning a bunch of views or beliefs or things that you don't even know if they're true or not because you've never examined them. And so the main thing that I try to do is just limit my consumption of information so it's not happening too quickly. Like I mentioned, I read slowly, but I also try not to take in too much reading, too much listening, too many things like that in a day without enough thinking time also to process it. My rough heuristic is that people on average probably spend 80% of their time consuming information and 20% thinking about it. And actually to have a healthy and well-informed worldview, it should be the opposite. You should probably spend 20% of your time taking information, 80% of your time processing it.
For news, I subscribe to Flipside, which is a newsletter that has one news story a day, and it summarizes a viewpoint from the left and from the right, and then sometimes also give a libertarian perspective. And I feel like that's just the right amount of news. It's takes me 2 minutes to read, and it's one story. Usually in a given day, there's not more than one story that's really worth learning about. So I feel like that's a good way for me to limit the amount of intake.
I also like the flip side. My personal preference is I actually think that the correct amount of news stories that are helpful to consume in any given day is closer to 0. I think that history is a lot more interesting than news. People really care about who is Trump going to pick to, be his next cabinet, secretary of X, Y, and Z. And actually looking back, I was really into this when Biden was elected too. Who's he going to pick for this and this? It was in the news, and I was eagerly anticipating the news because it felt interesting. But a few years later, I don't even remember who that person is, even though they're currently in office, and it's therefore probably even more important than when they were first picked. I think people get into this cycle, a hype cycle, basically, for the news. This is exciting, this is interesting, just because it's on all the time, or because people are talking about it all the time. But it's not intrinsically interesting or even practical to your life. Whereas I think there's so many interesting things we can learn from history, because history is so long, and you could just take the most interesting parts. I've kind of always hoped that someone would start a newsletter where instead of every day, it's here's what's happening today in the news. It's I just picked this really interesting day in history, and I'm going to tell you about what happened on that day.
Do you think we can learn more from history than we learn from the news happening now?
Absolutely. I think one of those reasons is, like I mentioned, there's just more history, so you could pick apart like the interesting days, right? Probably 364 days of the year weren't that important, or they weren't important some place in the globe, and you could pick a different place if there's something to really learn. But I also think another reason is just the adage that comes from Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. History tends to repeat itself. Human behavior repeats itself. I don't think that human psychology has fundamentally changed over the past few thousand years, even though the world has changed a lot. And so if you want to understand people, I think you can learn as much, if not even more, from seeing how people over long periods of time have like reacted to changes in the world, rather than like what's happening today in the news.
Another mental skill that I know you teach about is facing rejection. Tell us about that, why that's important.
There was one semester in college that I called my winter of rejection, where I felt like I was being rejected from everything. So I was in some political like student group and I ran for president and I lost the election. Then they let you drop down. So I dropped down to vice president. I lost that election. Then I dropped down to treasurer and I lost. So I lost every position. I was really into theater and I auditioned for 2 plays. I didn't even get cast in both the plays, not even like a bit role. I applied to the theater to direct a play for the next year and I got rejected from that. There was a girl that I had a crush on, and we actually like gotten to know each other pretty well, and I asked her out, finally had the courage, and she rejected me. And so at the end of this whole semester of rejection, I kind of took a 1-week break during our vacation. I was in the mountains, like hiking with a friend, and I was just thinking, one way to approach these rejections is that they're actually giving me a superpower. And that superpower is not being afraid of rejections. Because if you're not afraid of being rejected, you'd be willing to try basically anything. I think fear of rejection holds people back from pursuing an opportunity like a new job or asking someone on a date, because you know the rejection's going to hurt. But if you kind of inoculate yourself, if you get hurt or stung enough times by the rejection that doesn't hurt as much anymore, then you'd be willing to try all kinds of things. And so I went back to campus with that new attitude of like, I'm going to treasure these rejections because they're inoculating me against the future. The girl that I ended up asking out and getting rejected from, later I asked her out again and she said yes, and we are now married. That's Charlotte. And when we actually shortly after we got married and we were sort of starting our careers, we created a rejection treasure chest at home. You said every time we get rejected from an opportunity, we're going to print out the letter and put it in our treasure chest so we can treasure them instead of fearing them.
Oh, that's such a nice reframe. It's so interesting how bad rejection feels, even when it doesn't have very severe consequences for us, right? You know, people are so afraid to be rejected, they won't ask out the attractive person they've been talking to for the last hour, and then they never see the person again, right? It's just because they were so afraid of being rejected. But, you know, the reality is if they were rejected, probably, you know, a few weeks later, they wouldn't even think about it anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, the salves that I think can help in the moment to alleviate that pain of being rejected is to remember that one of the reasons rejection hurts is it feels like someone else has evaluated as a person and determined you're not good enough. So you apply for a job, right? You're like, they saw my resume, I even interviewed with them, they got to know me, whatever, and they determined I'm not good enough. That hurts. But it hurts a little bit less if you realize they actually don't know you that well. They didn't get to know you that much. Maybe if they'd gotten to see an even more complete picture of you, they would have realized that you would have been amazing for that job. Same thing with asking someone out on a date, right? It's like maybe this person doesn't know you well enough. If they knew you well enough, they would think you're amazing and like definitely want to date you. And so in the moment, we tend to have this feeling of like my entire personhood has been deemed not worthy, instead of the reality, which is this one small aspect of my personhood that I had a very small and limited window to show, got rejected.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have so much evidence about ourselves that any kind of additional evidence like that, like being rejected by a person or not getting a job, surely that couldn't rationally really tell us that much about ourselves.
In some cases, I think it can be edifying, right? Like sometimes if someone really gets to know you, determines something is not right for you, that can teach you something about yourself. But I think that lesson very rarely gets sort of integrated because the pain of the rejection is so great. I aspire to this level of like zen-ness where you'd say rejections just don't hurt me at all. And not only can I not feel stung by them, but I can also like see some of the truth in them and try to learn from that small grain of truth.
Right. I guess there's a big difference between, you know, you apply to a job and 100 other people apply and you get rejected. And there clearly it means very little that you're rejected. Or you met someone for an hour and they didn't want to go on a date, right? Clearly it doesn't mean very much. Versus someone gets to know you deeply and then they, you know, you date them for 2 years and then they leave you because they're unhappy. Like that is a real learning lesson, right? That's a different sort of rejection.
Another way of putting it might be a lot of people live their lives in a way where they're trying to impress people who don't care about them. I think it's better to live your life in a way where you're trying to impress the people who do care about you. Meaning, if you get some kind of fancy job or are dating someone who's like conventionally desirable, then some random person you don't know or someone in your peer group might say like, oh, you're impressive. But those people don't actually care about you, meaning they don't have your best interests at heart. And the people who do care about you do. And so if you think, I want the people who care about me and who know me best and actually know what's best for me more than some stranger, to impress them, those tend to mean things that are more like, as David Brooks puts it, the eulogy values rather than the resume values. People who know you best and who care about you the most tend to be impressed when you do something that's kind or show up for someone in a friendship or relationship.
It seems that social media really impresses on us this urge to impress the people that don't care about you, right? Like it's sort of the whole point in a way, right? It's trying to get you to post for other people that are not in your close circle.
Exactly. That's probably exacerbating the problem. I think social media has made it a lot worse, but it probably existed for almost all of human civilization for a variety of reasons. I mean, if you subscribe to evolutionary psychology, there might be reasons it was evolutionary advantage to be impressive to people in your group, even if they don't care about you that much, because it might mean that you can, survive or in some other ways. But I think a lot of those reasons are obsolete now. And so social media preys on that, fundamental psychology in ways that can make it really unhealthy. And if you can step back and just say, none of these people online actually know about me, even worse, they don't even care about me. And so they might be encouraging me to do something that's bad for myself. I think the best, most obvious example is like some kind of like stupid stunt or prank, right? That you could hurt yourself. Like you get a lot of likes or a lot of views for that kind of thing. The people who are watching it don't care if you were actually hurt or not. It's kind of an inane example. I know not a ton of people do like public pranks like that, but I think it demonstrates this principle that like, if you're going for people's attention or what might impress them for a short period of time, you're not actually doing what's going to impress them over a lifetime, which tend to be more of those values of like kindness and so forth.
There's a wonderful essay by C.S. Lewis called The Inner Ring. I don't know if you happen to be familiar with it. It's about how many people spend their lives trying to get into the inner ring, which is sort of whoever they think of as being cool, they want to be accepted by that group. And then, of course, when they get in the inner ring, they discover often there's an inner ring inside the inner ring that they're still outside of. And it's sort of this endless chase and about how what an unfulfilling life that really is. So it's a lovely essay for anyone interested in this.
I would say my own experience validates that. Through my work, I work with a lot of very successful people. I run a community for like CEOs and political leaders and things like that. In itself is extremely exclusive and invite only and so forth. But sometimes even the people in these communities feel like there's even more exclusive communities. In order to get into those, they need to, make more money or aspire to a higher height in their career or something like that. And so if you're just constantly trying to fulfill yourself by what's coming next on this path that I'm on, you're basically never going to be happy. I think is like the general principle that it boils down to. There's a really wonderful summary of Proust's novels that was written by the guy who runs the School of Life. It's on the website. And in the summary, he's describing one of the stories in Proust's novels, basically what you said, of like he's trying to get into these more and more elite social circles. And what he realized at the end is it was driven by this belief that, like, if you get to the innermost circle, the people there will finally be the people who you want to spend your time with because they're more interesting or better friends or something better to be around than all those other people. And what he realized at the end is the rate of people who are, like, good to be friends with is just totally evenly distributed across all of these circles. It makes no difference if they're in the innermost circle or the outermost circle. The qualities you want in a friend, like how kind and interesting they are, actually are not correlated with that at all. And probably in some cases are even reverse correlated.
Right. Certainly these kind of inner circles often attract people who are desperate to be in inner circles, and that's their number one priority in life. And that often does not make for a good friendship.
Yeah. And going back to that concept of like striving for the next thing, it's actually something I try to mention right after I talk about rejection, because rejection is like you're trying to get something for your life. You're trying to get a new job or some title or something like that. But actually, I think what is a bigger problem for most people is not what to do when you get rejected, but what to do when you get accepted. For a lot of people, achieving something presents an even worse problem than not getting it, because now you have it, but are you happy? And if your entire wiring is in this like achievement mindset of like, I will be happy when I get the next thing, you will never be happy, because once you have that thing, then you're going to want to get the next thing. So the metaphor I use is like you're climbing a mountain, you're trying to reach the summit. But whenever you reach a summit, you just see that there's another mountain with an even taller summit, and now you need to climb that one. And so if you never stop to enjoy the view and look down at how far you came and celebrate your achievement, then you're never going to be happy.
Raffi, I know that you have a book coming out. Do you want to take a moment to tell us about that?
It's called How to Be a Grown-Up. So this is based on the course that I taught at Boston College. About adulting. And that course itself was born out of my experience working with young people as a career coach, and my own experience in the workplace, just realizing that I'd gone to a good college and had a good job and so forth, but I still didn't know all these fundamental things that could set me up for a better life and a better adulthood. And that includes all the topics we mentioned, like personal finance and careers and happiness and relationships. And so what I tried to do over many years is condense that information into a 14-week course. And now the 14-week course is essentially a 14-chapter book that anyone can read, and hopefully more people than just those students can benefit from that knowledge.
And we'll be sure to put a link in the show notes for anyone interested in checking out his book. Raffi, any final thought you want to leave the listener with before we wrap up?
I guess my final thought is knowledge can only get you so far. My personal mission here is to try to equip people with more knowledge, at the very least knowledge that I wish I had had when I was younger. But unless you put that knowledge into practice, it's basically not going to do anything for you. And I think the hardest thing about putting knowledge into practice is that, like, we live most of our lives on autopilot. We're basically acting every day according to the patterns and the rhythms that have been sort of like worn into like the grooves of our brain. And unless you break out of autopilot, you can't really change the way that you act. And so I encourage everyone who's trying to learn new things and wants to put into practice to basically say, how can I actually start doing this thing today and keep track of whether I'm doing it today? And that opens up a whole other can of worms on this topic of habit formation, which I think, Spencer, you're an expert on. I would encourage everyone to read your stuff about. But basically to recognize that in order to break out of that autopilot, you have to decide that you want to live your life on purpose, not according to these expectations that have been ingrained in you, not according to these unconscious patterns that you just keep repeating every single day, but basically saying, I'm at the stage in life where I'm deciding for myself what I want. I'm using knowledge to figure out how to get there, and I'm going to do all that with a sense of intention.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Spencer. This was really fun.
Thanks again for listening. We always love to hear from our listeners, so if you have questions or comments for us, just send us an email at clearerthinkingpodcast@gmail.com. This episode was edited by Ryan Kessler and transcribed by We Amplify. Uri Bram is the podcast's factotum. If you like our show, then we'd really appreciate it if you could rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and tell your friends about us on social media. We also hope you'll subscribe to our email newsletter called One Helpful Idea. Each week, we'll send you one idea that we think is really valuable that you can read about in just 30 seconds, along with that week's new podcast episodes, an essay by Spencer, and announcements about upcoming events. To sign up for that newsletter or to find show notes, transcripts, and more info about the show, visit podcast.clearerthinking.org.